Whoa, he has trouble with the snap, and the ball is free. There goes Davis. Oh, my God. Davis is going to run it all the way back.
This is VSiN's College Football Betting Podcast.
Welcome in, everyone. Another week of college football is here after an absolutely wild weekend of college football and the NFL, by the way, and condolences to the 56% of people who lost out in Circus Survivor. I am proud to say my one entry is somehow still alive. And also, hopefully this week in college football, we won't see any coaches settling for a 64-yard field goal with a minute to go and a $200+ million quarterback. But I digress because Adam Burke is here at Skating Tripods on Twitter. It is our weekly look at the market, some buy low, some sell high, some letdown, some look ahead, situational spots that we like to point out. And we'll also get you updated on the latest power ratings because they're always being tweaked. You always should be tweaking your own power ratings, and up on vsin.com. That's where you can see Adam's most recent article. As always, please tell a friend, tell many friends, family members, whatever you have to do. Let's keep it rolling. The VSiN College Football Betting Podcast. Let's keep this momentum train rocking here. You will get 3 different shows on your feed every Sunday following the College Lines Revealed show with Jonathan Von Tobel. That will be in your feed. This podcast in your feed on Tuesday mornings. And then on Thursdays, afternoon, evening time, myself and Matt Humans will be breaking down the full college football card with best bets and analysis on all of the big games. So once again, please subscribe, rate, review, do what you have to do. But with that all being said, welcome in my partner in crime in the early week shows, Adam Burke. And make sure to check out his articles on vsin.com. And the one we always like to start with, Adam, is your updated power ratings and your adjustments. And we like to do a little stock up and stock down. And I think you have to start with the team that I follow as closely as any team, and that would be Notre Dame, losing to Marshall as a 20.5-point favorite, 26-21. And the thing about this game, Adam, as many people know, this wasn't really a fluke. Marshall outplayed Notre Dame, and if Notre Dame found a way to win, a la Toledo last year, it would have been looked at as, well, they were fortunate to win. Now, you could look at some things and say, hey, they should have done this, they should have done that, and they could have got out of there with the victory. That all being said, Notre Dame loses. They don't look the part as a top 10 or even top 25 team, Adam, and Tyler Buchner, their starting quarterback, is also now done for the year, so insert Drew Pine. So what type of adjustment did you make for the Irish after falling to Marshall on Saturday?
Yeah, good to be back with you here, Tim. By the way, one of my 2 Survivor entries went out. I had the 49ers in the Swamp, Mud Bowl, whatever you want to call that, and then also the Ravens, which, about the only really popular team that won here this week. But as far as Notre Dame goes, I moved the Irish down 6 points, but that was also before finding out that Tyler Buchner's out for the year. So probably would necessitate maybe another 2 to 3 point move down on Notre Dame. Once I put the article up, I leave it. I don't want to be, in the act of changing it throughout the week, anything like that. That's just kind of disingenuous to the people that read it right away. So there will be another adjustment to the Fighting Irish for next week. And in fact, my line against Cal is still a little bit high here this week as well. So I will be moving Notre Dame down some more, but I moved them down 6 points, and that was pre finding out that Buchner would be out for the rest of the year. And look, there were questions about this team on the offensive line. I know you and I kind of talked about that coming out of the Ohio State game in text more so than on the show. But I thought it was really striking in that Ohio State game that they just didn't really trust Buchner to throw the ball, and he didn't really trust his receivers either. So it was just a very disjointed, very jumbled offense. Obviously, things didn't get any better for them against Marshall. So drop Notre Dame down 6 points, but I will be moving them down a few more points as we head into week 4.
Yeah, just kind of final thoughts on Notre Dame. I think if people spent the 3+ hours on Saturday afternoon watching Notre Dame lose to Marshall, whether you had a ticket on the Irish or ticket on the Herd or the under, whatever it may have been, the thing that I was most disappointed in was the offensive line. This was supposed to be a strength. and the fact that they really got no push on Marshall. Now, Marshall, I got to give them credit, right? They had a game plan. They recognized that Notre Dame didn't have quality elite wide receivers that would make them, take advantage of the fact that they were doing press man, and they loaded up the box. And I thought the game plan for Marshall was a really quality one. So we'll see what the Thundering Herd do, moving forward in the Sun Belt. But as we all know, the Sun Belt had just an enormous weekend, and one team in the Sun Belt that's part of one of your biggest risers as we look at a stock up is the Clay Helton-led Georgia Southern squad. What the irony of him being fired after week 2 last year at USC, and now he's on the other side of a coach being fired after week 2, of course, being Scott Frost. So 600-plus yards of offense for Georgia Southern on Saturday night in Lincoln. What adjustment did you make to the Georgia Southern Eagles?
Well, I'll say this. One of my favorite season win totals coming into the year was Georgia Southern under 4.5. They were transitioning offensive schemes. They were going from kind of a modified triple option to an air raid. They brought in the co-offensive coordinator from Western Kentucky. And Western Kentucky, they chucked it all over the yard last year. So I'm thinking, okay, Kyle Van Treese came over from Buffalo. He did get some Division I starts, but, it's going to take time for everything to come together here. Apparently I was wrong, because Georgia Southern scored 104 points in their first 2 games. Now, Morgan State is terrible, and Nebraska is obviously a dysfunctional mess, but I moved Georgia Southern up 4 points here in my power ratings this week, and frankly, that may not be enough, although they are a pretty big dog here against UAB in week 3, but they've obviously adjusted much quicker than I anticipated. Maybe it's a sign of, Clay Helton being a pretty good coach in a place where there's not a ton of expectations. But I did move Georgia Southern up 4 points here, and we'll see if I have to move them up again, because UAB, a team obviously well known for their defense, we'll see what Georgia Southern does against the Blazers, and if they show well in that game again, then that's one where, I probably will have to make another adjustment to Georgia Southern. But with that being said, my line in the game is 15.5, market is 12, so it looks like I'm going to have to make an adjustment on Georgia Southern no matter what.
Well, and that's, as we kind of bounce around, I'll get more to the letdown spots, as I pointed out a handful coming off of the big weekend. You just wonder, a la Old Dominion this past weekend, as they played East Carolina fresh off their win over Virginia Tech, which I'll say the difference between Georgia Southern's win over Nebraska and Old Dominion's win over Virginia Tech is I didn't think Georgia Southern was very fluky. As you look at Old Dominion, they had 5 turnovers. Forced 5 turnovers, that is, against Virginia Tech. But you do wonder, after that huge win, Saturday night game, now you go on the road to UAB, what's the mindset like? So always a tricky spot to come off a win like that. Huge for the program on the road, and if you can kind of turn it around. So we'll get to those situational spots in just a little bit. Back to the stock down and your power ratings. Pitt dropping 5 points in your power ratings. They do have some questions, obviously, with injuries, so that is a concern. But what was the big reason behind the Panthers dropping the second most in your power ratings this past week?
Yeah, so this is pretty twofold. I mean, first of all, Keaton Slovis being out obviously doesn't help. And also I saw on Twitter, and I'm going to have to double check this, I was out of town for a wedding this past weekend, but I did also see somebody say that backup quarterback Nick Patty also is dealing with a sprained ankle. So you've got cluster injuries now at the quarterback position, which is never a good thing. But also, I had the Tennessee Pitt line last week at 3.5, and that line closed 6.5, pretty much market wide. And the game did go to overtime. Tennessee won by 7. They did cover the number for pretty much everybody that played that game. Did go to overtime. I thought that line was high, so I didn't want to over-adjust Pitt, because I think Tennessee is just at the top of the market right now, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But I had to adjust Pitt in some way. Anytime my number is off, 3, 4, 5 points from a game, I have to make some kind of move. But then you also factor in the quarterback injuries, and then you really have to make a move. So I'm pretty close to the number here in a really interesting game between Pitt and Western Michigan, a revenge game for the Panthers as they go up to Kalamazoo. They lost 44-41 at Heinz Field last year. So now they'll try to get road revenge here against the Broncos. But I moved Pitt down 5 points. I think that's maybe enough. but we'll kind of see how they look, especially without Slovis in the lineup.
All right, final team in your to mention in stock down. Um, I ended up taking a money line price on Iowa last weekend, and that was as painful as it gets. And I have my own. I only have myself to blame on that one. You would think Iowa State, who has had a Iowa problem for years, with all of the new faces there, with an adjustment of I think 9.5 points, Adam, from game of the year line at South Point over the summer, which was Iowa minus 13, to what the price was this week, which was Iowa minus 3.5. I didn't want to lay the 3.5 because I just felt like it was inevitable that that hook would come into play. So I took a money line price on Iowa, and it was a poor position on my part because they scored 7 points again. At least they scored a touchdown this time. So 2 games into the season, they've played FCS South Dakota State and Iowa State, who's expected to be, middle of the pack Big 12, and they have scored a combined 14 points this year. What have you done with Iowa, at least to this point there, Adam?
Yeah, for Iowa here through 2 games. And look, let's be honest. I mean, people look at FCS teams with a very negative connotation.
South Dakota State's good.
Really good one. I mean, they are a very, very good football team. And we'll talk about another really good FCS
Gave
team.
out South Dakota State on this podcast. I got to pat myself on the back when I get winners, because I believe last week on this show I said Appalachian State was a fade this past week. That was a good call by me.
Yeah, we've had a few good calls, but we've had some that you really want to have a short memory
The good thing is about the App State game, real quickly, was I played it last week when we spoke about it, because I'm a big situational bettor, and I just felt like this was a letdown spot. However many overtimes, 63-61, you're going on the road, humidity, all that. And I laid 17. It closes 18.5, 19. I'm like, all right, market's moving in my direction. And they lost outright. So the good thing is I don't lose extra money for having such a horrendous bet like Appalachian State catching 17.
Yeah, and the scary thing about that is App State completely pushed Texas A&M around in that game, and that'll kind of filter into my handicap if we talk about it later in the show of Miami and Texas A&M. But with regards to Iowa, I mean, look, I think Iowa State's a very well-coached team. They had 6-time revenge in that game, so they were. I mean, that's their game of the year. That's their Super Bowl. That's kind of their bowl game, so to speak. But, I mean, they had also lost 6 in a row, So for Iowa, that's a really, really poor performance again offensively. They have 2.8 yards per play in their 2 games. The next lowest in the country is UMass with 3.36. So Iowa is far and away the worst offense in the country here so far. Again, they have played 2 formidable opponents, but I dropped them down 4 points. And frankly, last year's Iowa team was a little bit misleading because they had such a big turnover margin advantage early on in the season. They should have lost that game to Penn State where Sean Clifford got hurt. They were, plus 6 or 7 in turnover margin against Maryland. This is an Iowa team that offensively they've been bad for a while. So I dropped them 4 points here this week. Maybe that's too much because I was pretty much right on the market number for the Cyhawk game last week. But Iowa's a team I'd rather be against than be on at this point in time. So sometimes I'll do that with my power ratings. I'll kind of inflate how much I move up or move down a team based on whether or not I have interest in playing on them or playing against them.
Well, you and I, we do this podcast because we love college football, and I love betting on college football. It's a sport that I would sit down and watch every day, all day. That being said, how much money would you need to be paid to sit down and watch Nevada, Iowa on Saturday night, Adam?
A lot.
Nevada, by the way, the mighty Wolfpack coming off of a 2-touchdown loss to Incarnate Word over the weekend.
They gave up 650 yards or something like that to Incarnate Word.
I mean, Iowa's laying 24 at some spots in Vegas right now. They have scored 14 points this year, and they are laying 24 at some spots.
With a total of 39.
Sometimes you just have to, I mean, that's the real nerd, and I think the two of us and probably a lot of our listeners, I could look at point spreads and laugh when you look at a total of 39 and a spread of 23.5 or 24 for Iowa and Nevada on Saturday night. So gotta love it. Gotta love college football in the imperfections, as we saw in the betting, in the kicking game. Well, we saw in the NFL too, and just the wide variance of point spreads and totals. You look at a total like SMU Maryland 73.5. Then you look at a total in Nevada and Iowa at 39. So you gotta love. You gotta love this imperfect sport that we call college football. All right, a couple more just quick stock ups for you. Once again, head to vsin.com. Adam's updated power ratings every Monday morning. So he gets after it, takes a look at the in-depth box score, and then puts out his updated power ratings each and every Monday morning. So check it out, and we'll always be reacting to them here. Syracuse continues to play some solid football, and they continue to be a riser for you.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to kind of talk about this here that, a lot of teams have been not trustworthy. I mean, they've been the polar opposite of trustworthy here so far. A lot of huge variances from one game to the next. Syracuse has looked good in both of their games here. And, they really manhandled Louisville back in week 1. And then Louisville, in a game that did not help you at all, holding UCF over their season win total.
Nope.
Louisville goes on the road to the bounce house and beats UCF. It was a horrible football game. I mean, it was very, very ugly. But Louisville, that's a good win for them, going on the road to beat UCF. So that kind of inflates Syracuse's week 1 win, in my opinion. Then they blew out UConn. And honestly, UConn had played well through their first 2 games. I realize that Utah State is dropping fast down everybody's power ratings, and Central Connecticut State's not very good, but we don't come into the season with any expectations for UConn ever under any circumstances. And Syracuse just shredded them on the road at the Rent. So this Syracuse team got a nice bump from me. I moved them up 4 points, but interestingly enough, I'm still kind of a little bit wishy-washy on their game here this week when they take on Purdue. That game's kind of a coin flip market wide. I have Purdue minus half a point in my numbers. So it seems like I've got a pretty good power rating here on Syracuse now that I bumped them up 4 points.
Yeah, that is really a tricky spot, and I pointed that out on Tuesday night's VSiN Primetime with Sean King, which was, I thought that was a situational spot to maybe bet against Syracuse, laying a pretty big number. I actually did not pull the trigger. I always point these out, and we'll point out some situational spots here momentarily, just to talk about it, not to play all of them. But I thought that was a situational spot for Syracuse, and I credit them for going into a weird atmosphere, night game, UConn. I don't know how many people were there, outside of, our program directors, like, cousins, John Goulet. But I can't imagine many people were there at the Rent, and they took care of business. They won by 34. So, Dino Babers, they got some things figured out. Virginia's old offensive coordinator up there, and, props to them. They're going to be a tricky team for sure as the year goes on. Some buy low, sell high, as fresh off of your stock up, stop down. Another way to look at it is, maybe after a couple big wins, you sell high on the market, or you could buy a low. So who are some teams that you either selling high or buying low on heading into this week?
One thing I want to mention about Syracuse real quick, and I wrote an article about this over the offseason over at vsin.com about teams that I felt upgraded at the offensive coordinator spot. And with Syracuse getting Robert and I from Virginia, with Virginia kind of turning over everything, Bronco Mendenhall retiring and all that, that's a massive upgrade over Sterling Gilbert. So Syracuse has really made an offensive leap. Garrett Schrader's been great through 2 games here. So I think that kind of underscores the importance of coming into a season anticipating that teams will be better offensively because they hire better offensive coordinators, because they upgrade at that position. Syracuse has done that. Obviously, we'll see what they kind of do going forward here with Purdue, Virginia. Then when they hit, the stretch of NC State, Clemson, Notre Dame, Pitt, that's where we'll really find out about the Orange. But I just wanted to mention that with the big upgrade in terms of the offensive coordinator there for them. I'll tell you a team I want to sell high on right now, Tim. And we started talking about this a little bit before the show. Tennessee, at least according to my power ratings, is being lined like they're a top 5 team. And I don't think Tennessee is a top 5 team. As I mentioned last week, they were on the road at Pitt, laying virtually a touchdown in that game. That was 3.5 points higher than I had the line. This week they take on Akron, and obviously Akron is god-awful, as I would know, being an Akron alum. But, I mean, they're laying 50, essentially, in that game. I don't have that
48.
game that high. And then, what does this line look like when they host Florida next week? I think that'll be a really good litmus test to see kind of what the actual power rating is for Tennessee. And the reality of it is, like I said, they're being lined like a top 5 team. I keep having to move them up. I have them 6th in the country now. But
Wow.
I don't buy it. I don't believe in it, where I get it. Hendon Hooker's been good, but they very easily could have lost that game to Pitt last week. The game went to overtime for a reason. They got blown out by Georgia last year, blown out by Alabama, blown out by Florida, lost to Pitt. Maybe year over year, they're a lot better. They lost to Purdue in the bowl game too, 48-45. But I think that this team is just being priced way too high at this point in time. Can't really fade them this week against the Zips, but I may come back on Florida here next week against Tennessee on the road at Rocky Top.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that was actually one of the games I targeted in some possible look ahead spots. Last week I mentioned, I want to say 6 games and some possible look ahead spots, and only one of those teams ended up covering. And you look at Oklahoma struggled in their game against Kent State early on. Nebraska loses outright. So that was a look ahead spot for the Oklahoma-Nebraska game. Auburn struggled against San Jose State. They're playing Penn State this week. And then both Miami and Texas A&M didn't cover as they play each other this weekend. Texas A&M, of course, losing outright. So, sometimes, look, I mentioned look ahead spots. It's not always a, trusted science. Things just might be a bad matchup. But in particular, I felt like the look ahead spots were profitable last week to fade. So I want to jump into a couple things to maybe for folks to look at. We'll do look aheads first and letdowns. I just want to throw them your way, Adam. And as I always say, this isn't a foolproof system. There's no such thing in gambling. But I do like to look situationally more so in college than in the NFL, because we know they're 18 to 22-year-olds. Sometimes when you're playing a perceived not great team, you're not going to be as motivated as you would for a big time game. So a couple look ahead spots I want to throw your way. You mentioned Tennessee. They play Akron this weekend. They're a 48-point favorite. Next weekend, they play Florida. Wake Forest. Great to see Sam Hartman back. Wonderful story that he's back on the field. Great for Wake Forest because they're a good football team, obviously. I think they have a real chance to host College Game Day in Winston-Salem next weekend when Clemson comes to town, Adam. Oh, by the way, they have to play Liberty this weekend, and they're a 16.5-point favorite. Kansas State has been rolling. Very impressive to see them over the weekend dismantle Mizzou, even though Adrian Martinez hasn't really done anything as a quarterback there in Manhattan. On deck for them, a trip to Norman. In the middle, the covering machine that is the Fighting Sean Kings, the Tulane Green Wave, as Tulane is catching 15. And then I think the ultimate letdown look-ahead sandwich is Oregon State this weekend. Oregon State, Adam, just had a thrilling win over Fresno State. Jonathan Smith showing his manhood as he opted to go for a touchdown instead of kick a field goal and force overtime against Fresno State. The gamble paid off. They beat Fresno State in a thriller on the road, 32-29. They opened up the season with that impressive win over Boise State. Next weekend, in a game no one will get to see because it's on the Pac-12 network, they host USC. In the middle, they have to go to a neutral site, the Portland Timber Stadium, which is about 80 miles away from Corvallis, and play the number 4 team in the FCS rankings in Montana State. So good luck there. No line there on that one. But I think that is a horrendous situational spot for Oregon State this weekend.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, and as you mentioned, Montana State's a really, really good football team. And again, you have to put these FCS teams into the proper context. I mean, not all of them are doormats going to get paychecks. Some of these teams are very legitimate, better than a lot of the group of 5 teams out there. Now, Montana State, according to Sagarin, would be about a 17-point dog in this
Give
game
me
on a
those
neutral.
points.
So
Gimme.
we'll see what that line actually looks like. Again, Sagarin, just one example of what's kind of out there. And I know our good mutual friend Brad Powers does power rate FCS, so I'll be curious to kind of see what his number is for that one. I think Wake Forest is one to really talk about here because you get the bump of Sam Hartman coming back, and also not only did Sam Hartman come back, he looked pretty damn good in the process too. I mean, he's a very, very quality quarterback. But Liberty is a dangerous team. So I think it's actually a benefit. I want to say addition by subtraction because that's kind of a mean way to put it. But Charlie Brewer's bounced around so much that at this point, I don't know if he's that good of a player. But Caden Salter, who's taken over for Liberty here, orchestrated a game-winning touchdown drive in the game where Brewer got hurt, played really well last week against a very stingy UAB defense, and he's a dual threat type of guy. And look, Wake Forest's offense is great. We know that. We know that they've done very well with Hartman, with some of the skill guys that they've had. Wake Forest's defense is not so great. So I'm kind of worried about Wake Forest here. I don't know if they lose this game necessarily as a 16 and a half point favorite, but I do think that Liberty can absolutely keep this game close. And I also think there's a chance that it kind of becomes a track meet as well. So I kind of lean over 63 and a half there. But that's a very scary spot, I think, for Wake Forest. Taking out a Liberty team that is pretty dangerous, not only in advance of playing Clemson, but also playing Florida State. So back-to-back big games there in the Atlantic Division for the Demon Deacons.
Yeah, and I think Wake Forest, they got a bump, and I thought it was too much. We talked about it on Thursday's pod when we got the news that Hartman would be back. I thought the bump was too much. I didn't ultimately pull the trigger, but it was on my list on Vanderbilt catching 13. And like you said, I thought Sam Hartman showed himself very well, which was great to see. But now catching, laying 16 and a half in a really tricky situational spot. You got to think about the motivation for Liberty too, an opportunity to beat an ACC team. They have some big games later on in the season, but in the middle portion of their schedule, after they play Wake Forest, it's Akron, it's Old Dominion, it's UMass, it's Gardner-Webb, and then they get some big boys at the end of the year like BYU and Arkansas and Virginia Tech. So this is a huge game for Liberty. An impressive start to the year with a win over UAB and Southern Miss, like you mentioned, coming back and winning that game in overtime. So I think that's a tricky spot, certainly for Wake Forest. Also, keep an eye if that stays north of 2 touchdowns and then Kansas State against Tulane. Tulane is a solid team. Willie Fritz has got a lot of pieces back. They're off to a 2-0 start. And an opportunity for K-State to go into Norman next week to make some noise against Oklahoma. That could be a kind of a letdown situation or a look ahead situation, I should say.
Let me give you one more look ahead real quick here. And I think this one's extremely important to point out. You mentioned already the very high total for the game here in College Park between SMU and Maryland. Next week,
Michigan.
SMU hosts TCU. Now, who was SMU's head coach last year? Sonny Dykes. Who is TCU's head coach? Sonny Dykes. These two teams hate each other. This is a massive rivalry in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. So SMU is going to host this game with Dykes on the other sideline. Look, SMU is a good team. I think they're a well-coached team. They're a very dynamic offensive team. They've scored 93 points in their first 2 games. Man, they got to be looking past Maryland here. This will be their first time leaving the state of Texas. They don't.
You think they're looking past a Power 5 team on prime time?
Yes, I think they are looking past Maryland because that TCU game means so much to them. With all of the circumstances, especially with Sonny Dykes, leaving the program, going to a rival. I mean, I just feel like, to me, that's a game that SMU really focuses on. And look, the last 2 games have been really good, 41-38, 42-34. They haven't played at Ford Stadium since 2018. TCU won that game by 30. So I think SMU looks past Maryland. I like the Terrapins this week. I think the Terrapins are actually a pretty good football team. But I do think SMU looks past that game this week.
Well, my first win total bet of this offseason was Maryland over 5.5 at circa -130. So this was the game that I targeted Adam as a must get against SMU, and I was a little worried when the market opened at circa at a pick, but clearly mines are with you because the number has moved up to 3.5. Maryland also a little bit of a look ahead spot. They go to Michigan and they get that big noon kickoff the following weekend. So maybe a little look ahead there. But for my win total, I'll stay off this one just because I'm invested in Maryland and basically from the get, I said they have to beat SMU. So that's in my eyes what my bet is kind of coming down on. If Maryland gets out to a 3-0 start, to find 3 conference wins with Indiana still out there, Northwestern, Rutgers, Michigan State's a possibility. I think we're in good shape there. So I need that one for sure.
This one, I mean, lines out to 3.5. My number is 6 on the game. So I even like Maryland a little bit from a power rating standpoint, let alone the fact that that's one of those games that's on the calendar for them every year. But now you add the coaching dynamics into it. And I think they put all their eggs in that basket, especially because, when you think about, some of these games, especially these rivalry games, I mean, these are huge from a recruiting standpoint. You're going to bring in guys that you want to try and attract to your campus for this rivalry atmosphere to kind of give them the full-fledged experience. That's a game that, from a coaching standpoint, you've got to be at your best because you can win or lose recruits based on what happens in those games, especially, in a high school football hotbed like Texas, where you've probably got a lot of kids in that DFW area that are, highly sought after.
All right, a couple letdown spots and then a weekday slate, but we will get to the 2 Friday night games here to wrap up the podcast. But let's just bounce around as a potential letdown spots. Texas. Last week, we pointed out UTSA as a tricky spot on the road at Army. I thought we had it handicapped properly. Army led by 2 touchdowns and ultimately lost in overtime and doesn't get the cover, which was a tough one to swallow. If you did get the 3 when it popped for a moment, well done by you folks. I had the 2.5 on the money line, wrote it up on the website. We talked about it on the podcast, and that ended up, unfortunately, being a loser. But the reason we pointed it out was UTSA was coming off that hard-fought loss to Houston and then an opportunity to go to Austin for the first time in school history the following weekend. So that weekend is now here. They play at Texas for the first time in school history. They've got, I'd say, the best quarterback on the field because Quinn Ewers is out. This isn't a knock to Hudson Card. I just think that Frank Harris is a really good quarterback. So you look at this line, it's kind of ping-ponged around a little bit. As of record right now, you're looking at Texas laying 11.5 or 12.5, depending on where you look. Open 14. Is this a letdown spot for Texas after really outplaying Alabama on Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, I certainly think it could be. I mean, again, you talk about games kind of being a team Super Bowl. For UTSA getting a crack at the Longhorns, obviously a big deal for them. My line's 13.5 on this game, so I was a little bit closer to the open than the number that's out there now. But I actually want to ask you 2 other questions. First one, does Texas win this game if Quinn Ewers doesn't get hurt?
Yes.
Second, how concerned are you about Alabama right now? Because my thought coming out of the weekend was, is anybody good in college? Maybe Georgia's really good again, but is anybody good this year?
Well, and I guess I said very. I'm not very concerned. It's Nick Saban. They're going to figure things out. But I do think they have legitimate concerns at the playmaker positions. I thought the utilization of Jahmyr Gibbs as the game wore on went away, which didn't make any sense to me. And it almost felt like it came down to, Adam, all right, Bryce, just be Magic Man. And he has the ability to do it. He's unbelievable. And I know that Texas fans are upset with the refereeing, and there were some questionable calls, especially in my opinion, the hold that wasn't called on the right tackle there on the play where Bryce Young eluded the corner blitz. But I thought Alabama was untouchable this year, and I think that's certainly not the case because they showed that they're vulnerable on Saturday in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, and it's tough. I mean, my niece is not a football fan, so she opted to, schedule her wedding here for week 2 of the college football season, week 1 of the NFL season. Or at least put a TV at the reception. Although I had way too many Budweisers to know what was going on with the games anyway. But that was kind of the question. There's only so much that a box score can tell you. And the reason why, one of the 3 steps of my power ratings process is to really go through and study the box scores, because there can be things that are a little bit misleading with your eyes. At the same time, not everything can show up in a box score. You try to find short touchdown drives, big returns, defensive touchdowns obviously play a big role, turnover margin. I look a lot at yards per play differential, stuff like that. But, when you look at Alabama 20, Texas 19, there's no way in hell a box score can tell the full story of what happened in that game. So, that's why I asked you. That's why I'll be asking a lot of people here throughout the week, because, look, I mean, I maybe Texas is going to overperform a little bit this year, or at least maybe perform to their historic expectations. But that's one where I look at it and go, okay, should I be panicking about Alabama? Is there something wrong with this team? And to your point, the fact that Jahmyr Gibbs was your leading receiver with 9 catches for 74 yards when you have Bryce Young does speak to a lot of concerns at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, and I think that's something to keep an eye on, especially when they hit that gauntlet. Now, the Texas A&M game doesn't look as daunting, but Arkansas looks a little more challenging, certainly on that schedule. The Tennessee game is going to be quite the battle. But at the end of the day, Nick Saban is there, and the evil mind that's in his head. He's probably thrilled that they had a close loss to Texas. So that was the game that I pointed out. Just curious, Texas's mindset coming off of a heartbreaking game with school record crowd in attendance and all of that. I want to rifle through a couple of these potential letdown spots to you, Adam, and see what you think. So we got App State after they go to Texas A&M. They obviously win, really good performance, and now they come back home. College game day in Boone, North Carolina. They get Troy, and they're laying 13 in that one. We've got Marshall coming off of their win over Notre Dame. Now they have to go on the road to Bowling Green, who that was not an enjoyable game, which I did watch, against Eastern Kentucky. 7 overtimes, and FCS Eastern Kentucky got the win over Bowling Green. That game is Bowling Green catching 17 at home. Washington State, after they went to Wisconsin and pulled out the win there as a near 20-point underdog, they get Colorado State at home. And then Iowa State, after winning the Cy-Hawk Trophy for the first time in, 6 years, they turn around and have to play the Bobcats of Ohio. And this has actually seen a lot of movement in the market backing Ohio, as this game opened 22 and has moved to 18 as of time of record. So just those games that I ping-ponged around, anything jump out at you as a potential tricky letdown spot?
Yeah, I think the Ohio one's really interesting for a variety of reasons, because, again, first of all, I mean, we could make a case that this is maybe the lowest Iowa State team that Matt Campbell's had in a while, just because of the turnover from last year, losing Breece Hall, losing Brock Purdy, losing some other guys. And then, they still go, and this is the game where they beat Iowa. So, I think that's kind of an interesting one. I think a lot of that has to do with a low-scoring expectation more so than anything, because Iowa State only scored 10 points in that game against Iowa. And Iowa's defense is much better than Ohio's. But Ohio is, they had a pretty misleading game last week where they're not going to score, they're 2 weeks ago, where they're not going to score the way that they did against Florida Atlantic. So I think maybe that's just a low-scoring expectation, where it's kind of a math play of expecting the game to be in the mid-40s. You've got a spread of basically 3 touchdowns. You like to take the points in that situation. Kind of the same theory behind Nevada and Iowa, although we haven't seen a whole lot of Wolfpack money there. The App State one is fascinating, because I do think that Troy is a better team this season than they were last year. And App State, it's not even just coming off of the Texas A&M game. You just played back-to-back Power 5 opponents. You played 2 very, very different football games. What do you kind of get from them here in this one? I think is a really, really good question to ask. And honestly, I'm happy with where my power ratings are, because I have this game lined at 13. Markets at 12, 12.5, 13. So I've got it power rated pretty accurately. Yes, the spot comes into play, and maybe that's a reason to justify playing Troy. But I think you maybe kind of look for App State to possibly struggle next week, because now you run into a situation where Sean Clark can go, guys, everyone thinks that we're going to fall flat. Everyone thinks that we're going to let down. We can't let that happen. So they'll put a lot of emphasis on this game and kind of keeping up, their newfound standards. maybe the game after that or the game after that is kind of where, App State sort of falls off. So my hope, selfishly, is that App State wins this game by 21 plus, and then I can look to go against them when they get a little overinflated in the market.
Yeah, and clearly I misread App State last week as I recommended playing 17, which I did, and they won outright with Texas A&M. However, I do think what helps App State, I would say from a motivation point, is the fact that College game day is in Boone, North Carolina. So this is not in my eyes, really a letdown unless it's just physically taxing, like you mentioned. Back-to-back games against UNC and Texas A&M. Going back to the Texas UTSA game, UTSA has played down back-to-back overtime games. So are the Roadrunners, running on fumes a little bit? Does the depth show? My only question is teams playing after Alabama, did they get beat up a lot? You saw a lot of those teams historically, Adam, that opened up the season in that neutral site ass kicking at the hands of Alabama, usually kind of slowly came out of the gates. How does Texas rebound after playing Alabama? So I would have loved to catch the 14 at the opener with UTSA. I did not. But the Roadrunners would be something to look at. Went as low as 11, and then at circa started to bounce back up. And then one more that I wanted to mention, you mentioned to start the show, Georgia Southern on the road at UAB. They're catching 12. Is Georgia Southern just much better than we expected? Is this a clear letdown spot to go on the road to UAB? What do you expect from Georgia Southern and UAB with the Eagles fresh off a win over Nebraska catching 12?
I think it's really hard to know sort of where Georgia Southern is at this point in time because Morgan State's one of the worst FCS teams out there. That's just a really, really bad football team. So I'm not going to take anything away from that game. And on paper, it looks great to beat Nebraska, right? Especially to score 45 points against a Big Ten team when you're changing offensive schemes. At the same time, Nebraska was a mess, a complete mess. I think a lot of guys probably expected Scott Frost to be fired before the season even started. Then they open the year with him, lose over in Ireland to Northwestern. Then they're tied in the third quarter against North Dakota at home before winning that game by 17. I just think maybe that team was just completely out on Scott Frost, and it just sort of came to a head. So I don't know how good Georgia Southern is. We'll find out here probably this week and then in the coming weeks because they are in a really, really good division in the Sun Belt. But I couldn't touch that game at all whatsoever. I really, truly don't know what to do with that one. By the way, one other team I want to mention here, and you texted this to me about West Virginia being in a letdown spot last week, taking on Kansas after the big emotional backyard brawl game. What an interesting game this week between Kansas and Houston.
Yep.
Where Houston's also off of back-to-back overtime games against teams in Texas, UTSA and Texas Tech. And Texas Tech, Donovan Smith came in and had, 3 or 4 interceptions in that game, and Texas Tech still found a way to win it. So Houston's kind of in an interesting spot against a Kansas team that just scored 55 points against West Virginia. They don't win in the Big 12. They don't win on the road in the Big 12. Their season win total looks really good right now if you wind up taking the over. But that's a fascinating game, too, where I think Houston, to a degree, has underperformed. I had Houston as one of my higher-rated group of 5 teams, and they had all kinds of issues with UTSA. I don't want to say they gave away the game against Texas Tech, but that one was very winnable. Do they look like the Cougars I expected them to look like here in this game against Kansas? I guess we'll wait and see, but that's a really interesting game as well.
Yeah, Kansas was, and props to my partner on the show. He was a little more bold. We pointed it out on VSiN Primetime on Tuesday that I did point out that West Virginia was in a letdown spot playing Kansas. The Neil Brown video that anyone watched was very uninspiring that he gave to Mountaineer Nation. So yeah, that was a spot. Kansas initially I had on the letdown spots, but I put a line through it because I don't think it is taking on Houston as a 10-point underdog. Adam, to wrap things up, no Thursday night football this week for the college ranks. Couple games on Friday night. We've got Florida State and Louisville. So Louisville playing their second straight Friday night game, but they're back at home. And it looks like as of record, Louisville catching 2 against Florida State, who's coming off a bye. And then Air Force in Wyoming. We're recording this on Tuesday morning, full transparency. While we've been sitting here, this line has moved 2 points in favor of Wyoming. It was 17, Air Force laying 17. It's now down to 15, so not really sure why the movement on Tuesday morning towards the Pokes of Wyoming. But those 2 games are your Friday night games. Florida State, Louisville laying 2, and then Air Force, Wyoming. Air Force right now, as of Tuesday morning, laying 15 with a total of 46. Anything in either one of these games intrigue you?
Well, I think both of these games intrigue me for 2 very different reasons. I think, first of all, the line move on Air Force and Wyoming, we've also seen the total plummet in that game as well. So we know that Wyoming does not throw the forward pass all that effectively, and they really haven't for a long period of time. This will be, I know that people kind of joke about saying this on the network, but this will be a rock fight. I mean, this is going to be long drives, probably very long drives for Air Force, maybe long drives for Wyoming. Probably just a low-scoring expectation in the game, kind of dragging that spread down a little bit, because Air Force has been thoroughly dominant in their 2 games so far, and they were my favorite season win total over bet. So far, that one looks pretty good, kind of canceling out the Georgia Southern mess that I created. But Florida State and Louisville, so we talked about it already, and this is something that's been pretty striking, I think, early on here in the college football season. You've seen teams be very Jekyll and Hyde. Washington State struggled badly with Idaho. Then they go on the road to Camp Randall and beat Wisconsin in Madison. We've seen teams just kind of be all over the map. That's just one example. App State, right? They give up 60,000 points to North Carolina. They hold A&M to like 200 total yards of offense. So we've seen a lot of Jekyll and Hyde types of performances. So Louisville, good win over UCF on the road. Awful performance against Syracuse in that week 1 game. But Florida State, they looked so good in that LSU game for about 3.5 quarters. And then things kind of got away from them late in the 4th quarter. It became a game, obviously became kind of an instant classic there on college football, Monday Night Football before the NFL started. But I think we may not realize just how good Florida State can be. Jordan Travis looks much improved. Mike Norvell's maybe kind of establishing himself there. I think there's a reason why Florida State's moved into a pretty clear road favorite here. And even though I have Louisville minus 0.5 point in my power ratings, it's largely because I'm just not sure about Jordan Travis, but he looked great against LSU. I think that that's a very well-defined, very sharp line move on the Seminoles. And to me, it would imply that they're the right side in that game on Friday.
Yeah, and look, there's millions of people out there that have their own power ratings, and this is just one. But I'm looking at Bill Conley, the S&P Plus right now, and he has a slight lean towards Florida State as a 3.3, point favorite. So, to me, it's kind of a sit back. I thought UCF kind of handed that game to Louisville last Friday night. Was a really, I thought, poorly coached game by Gus Malzahn in a pretty juiced up environment. Big win for Scott Satterfield, but yeah, Florida State got the rest advantage now. Had last week off, so I would lean a little bit towards Florida State as we wrap up.
Let me ask you this real quick from a mindset standpoint. I know we're running a little bit long here, but I want to ask you from a mindset standpoint. Do you like the early bye? Because I think there's 2 ways you can look at it. One is, okay, you've isolated, because there's no preseason in college football, right? You've isolated the issues that your team has, so you can work on them early in the season. The downside is you don't really get into rhythm. You don't really get into the rhythm of the season when you have a bye early on. So what's kind of your take and your mentality on the early season bye?
Well, I think Florida State, I think it gives the advantage of, what Florida State was able to do, which was they scheduled that Duquesne game in week 0. So I felt like that was a huge advantage, in my opinion, for them to work out some kinks. And I know historically the numbers say if you play in week 0 and then play in week 1, it's actually not an advantage. But I thought you could clearly see an advantage there for them. And I like the fact that they have a week off to fully prepare for Louisville. Now Louisville had a normal week, right? It's not a short rest type of situation because they played last Friday. But, for Florida State, I think their schedule kind of works out nicely because they get 2 byes as opposed to most teams getting 1 bye. So, yeah, to me, I think it works to the advantage of Florida State because it breaks up the season well. So, I actually think it was an advantage there to get the bye. We'll see if my thought process works out, but yeah, I think it was for Florida State, at least in this particular instance. I think it was advantageous, Adam, to have that early bye because they still have another one. It's not like this is their only bye in the year and they're going to run out of gas. They're off late October too, before they wrap up the season with 5 consecutive games.
Yeah, I mean, I like it, and I also think that maybe it makes me sort of lean towards the over just a little bit, simply because you can work more into the playbook now. You're not trying to prep for an opponent. You're not trying to make sure that you've got a scout team working with the defense, that you've got the quarterback trying to run plays that are going to match up well against the defense that you're facing. You can kind of work in a lot more of your own route concepts and your own schemes and things like that. So I think maybe it upgrades Florida State's offensive potential in this game as well.
All right, as we wrap up, a couple games on my radar early on in letdown situations. Haven't pulled the trigger yet, but UTSA certainly is a spot that I'm looking at. Another letdown, Marshall, are they going to lay it on Bowling Green? It's possible. We'll see. That's a road spot. And then the situational spot I love the best this week is Oregon State. It's a neutral site game in Portland at the Portland Timber Stadium. I'm sure there'll be more Oregon State fans than Montana State fans there, but if this game is north of 2 touchdowns, like I said, with South Dakota State and Iowa, it's definitely a play on for Montana State coming off those back-to-back wins. USC the following week at home in Corvallis. I think it's just a weird spot. The fact that it's neutral site is kind of bizarre too. So that game is the number one on my radar, Montana State. Hopefully catching, if we could get 17, that would be glorious, but definitely anything north of 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, I'll be really curious to see what that number comes out at. Again, like I said, I was just using Sagarin, which does kind of have a little bit of recency bias towards this season, where I don't know how much Montana State lost from last year or anything like that. I'll let people smarter than me kind of figure that out.
Quarterback's back,
which always helps. That's definitely a big help. And ironically enough, James Madison, a team I moved up significantly in my power ratings, great FCS team, their quarterback was gone. And now Todd Centillo, who was very pedestrian at Colorado State, he's off to a very nice start for James Madison. So it's always tough with these FCS teams, how much they lose to the portal, especially with college football free agency and all of that. Few games that I'm looking at here. So there are 3.5s in town on Michigan State going up to take on Washington. And I love Kalen DeBoer. I think Kalen DeBoer is an excellent head coach. I think he will have a really big job here at some point in time. I mean, he's only 47 years old, spent a lot of time as a very successful coordinator. I think he's working his way towards a really good job. That being said, beating up on Kent State and then blowing out a Portland State team that put everything into that San Jose State game that they had a chance to win last week, or 2 weeks ago now, I guess it is. I'm thinking that Washington is a little bit of a sell high team at this point in time. I got to see a lot of Michael Penix at Indiana, and maybe he just has better talent around him here and better coaching. But I don't think that this guy's going to be able to sustain this level. I have Michigan State a road favorite in this game in my power ratings. I think at 3.5, I've got to take Sparty. Now that I'm back in town, I'll be able to do that, since Ohio is still behind the times when it comes to sports betting here. But I do like Michigan State getting the 3.5. That's a play that I'm definitely looking at. I like Miami this week too against Texas A&M, and I typically shy away from the really big games just because those tend to have pretty tight lines. But I think Josh Gaddis is a good offensive coordinator hire. I think him and Tyler Van Dyke should work really well together. I think Texas A&M has a coaching issue. I think Jimbo Fisher is recruiting very well, but I don't think he's a great coach. The offensive line at Texas A&M has really underperformed, I think, in a lot of cases, really. And they got pushed around last week by App State. So I do like Miami in that game. I got a little bit of power ratings value on that one. And I just think that the Hurricanes are a team I wanted to play on. I have that game line 2.5. It's 5.5 out there. So I do like the Hurricanes in that one. And then we talked about it earlier. I don't think we get a full-fledged effort here from SMU this week. I think they're looking ahead to that TCU game. It's a long trip out to Maryland. It's a little bit of a weird trip for them. Maryland can score. SMU can score as well. That's why that total's in the mid-70s. But I think that SMU, all of their eggs are in next week's basket. So I like Maryland laying that short price there. And one other one, I don't know what to do with this game, but I have North Texas favored over UNLV. Maybe UNLV is a lot better. Possibly. I don't know. I know a lot of people don't believe in Marcus Arroyo as a head coach, but I don't know. UNLV is laying 3, and it seems to me like it's kind of hard to take the Rebels laying a number against virtually anybody.
Yeah, and that might be a bit of a sell high spot on UNLV, right? They look decent against Idaho State. They covered last week a big number against Cal. Why Cal was ever laying double digits against anybody is beyond me. But Cal not able to cover that number. So yeah, maybe a bit of a sell high spot on UNLV. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition with Adam. Adam will have his official plays on the Thursday show that I will do with Matt Humans. Follow Adam on Twitter at Skating Tripods. Check out his updated power ratings article, vsin.com, each and every Monday. As we always say, please help out the pod. Let people know if you like what you're hearing. Rate us, review us, subscribe. That would give us a lot of help. So we will be back, myself, Matt Humans, breaking down the full card on Thursday. But for this edition of the VSiN College Football Betting Podcast, that's Adam Burke. I'm Tim Murray. We will talk to you on Thursday right here on the VSiN College Football Betting Podcast.